A 9-year-old girl with holes in her sneakers and coffee in her cup just collided with the most dangerous man in Chicago and soaked his $10,000 suit in front of his armed bodyguards. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She just looked up at him and said 4 words that no one in that alley had ever dared say to Dante Carraro. 2 minutes later, a bullet hit the wall behind him, and he realized the little girl hadn't tripped at all. If that has your attention, stay with us, because this story is about to show you what real courage looks like, and it has nothing to do with power, money, or weapons. Make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I've got another story coming tomorrow that you won't want to miss. Now, let's get back to it. Chicago doesn't sleep. It just gets quieter and more dangerous after midnight. The South Loop was wet that Thursday evening, the kind of cold, persistent rain that turns alley puddles into mirrors and makes the city look like it's staring back at itself. Steam drifted up from iron grates. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. The streets near Cavallo Nero, the most secretive members-only steakhouse in the city, had been quietly cleared by men who didn't wear uniforms, but whose presence everyone understood. Dante Carraro didn't need a reservation. He owned the building. At 42, Dante was the kind of man a room noticed before he said a word. 6'3", broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that belongs only to men who have learned that the most dangerous thing they can do is move too fast. His neck was tattooed. Dark, deliberate ink that climbed from his collar to his jaw. A record of a life built in the shadows of this city. His suit was custom. Italian fabric, hand-stitched lapels, cut specifically for the frame of a man who had never in his adult life allowed anything to be off. It had cost $10,000. He hadn't blinked at the price. He didn't blink at much anymore. Behind him, 2 steps back and 2 steps to each side, walked Marco and Sal. His lieutenants, his shadows, the 2 men who had been with him long enough to know that silence from Dante was not peace. It was processing. Tonight, something in him was processing loudly. The dinner had gone well, by any reasonable measure. 3 associates from the Northwest Side, a territory agreement signed over aged bourbon, no raised voices, clean, efficient. The kind of meeting that kept the city's various factions from colliding in ways that made the news. And yet, Dante paused at the mouth of the alley behind the restaurant, his breath fogging in the cold air. Marco and Sal stopped with him. This was habit. Dante always paused here, always scanned the alley before crossing to the waiting car. It was a ritual so old it had become invisible, like breathing. He was standing exactly where he always stood. He didn't know that someone had been counting on that. He didn't know that 40 feet above him, on a second-floor fire escape bolted to the back of a shuttered dry-cleaning shop. A 9-year-old girl named Maya had been watching the alley for the last 20 minutes. Not because she knew who he was, but because the fire escape was dry. He'd scanned the alley was where she'd found half a cup of leftover coffee balanced on a dumpster lid. And cold coffee was better than nothing when you hadn't eaten since morning. He didn't know any of that. What he knew, in the half-second before everything changed, was that the back of his neck was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the rain. Then came the sound of small sneakers scraping on wet metal, a gasp and a blur of gray fabric hurtling down from above. Maya hit the ground running. He skidded on the wet asphalt and slammed directly into Dante Carraro's chest with the full, chaotic energy of a child who had no other option. The paper cup exploded. Cold coffee, dark, salvaged, somebody else's, detonated across $10,000 worth of Italian fabric in a spreading brown stain that reached his collar, his shirt, his tie. Marco lunged. Sal's hand went to his jacket. The girl hit the ground and looked up, chest heaving, dark hair plastered across her face. And she didn't run. Well, that was the thing nobody in that alley could process. Every instinct said she should run. Every rule of the street said she should run. But Maya's eyes, dark brown, wide, and absolutely electric with urgency, went straight to Dante's chest. And she said it quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "There's a red dot on your suit, right where your heart is. It's been there for 30 seconds. Marco's hand froze. Sal went still. Dante looked down. The faintest tremor of red light was sliding off the wet fabric of his lapel, displaced now, wandering across empty air, because her collision had knocked him 6 inches forward from where he'd been standing. 6 inches. He had exactly enough time to understand what that meant before the silenced shot punched into the brick wall behind him with a sound like a fist hitting a mattress. Quiet, precise, professional, intended for him. Marco pulled Maya behind the dumpster. Sal had his weapon out, the eyes sweeping upward. Dante stood completely still in the middle of the alley, rain falling on his ruined suit, staring at the fresh crater in the brick wall at chest height. Then he turned and looked down at the girl crouched behind the dumpster, her dirty t-shirt, her worn-out sneakers, her small hands gripping the metal edge. She was shaking now. Not from fear, he realized. From cold. She'd been out here a long time. He looked at her for a long moment. "Where did you see it from?" he said. She pointed up at the fire escape without hesitation. Dante looked up, followed the angle, calculated the sight line, understood everything. He turned to Marco. "She comes with us." Marco blinked. "Boss, she comes with us," Dante repeated, not louder, just final. And that was the moment, standing in a wet alley in the South Loop with a ruined suit and a bullet still embedded in the wall behind him, that Dante Carraro's life changed. Not because of the sniper, not because of the betrayal he didn't yet know was coming, because of a 9-year-old girl who had nothing, feared no one, and had chosen, with a salvaged cup of cold coffee and 6 seconds of courage, to save a stranger's life. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know she'd overheard something 2 nights ago that would unravel everything he thought he knew about the people closest to him. He didn't know that the child he was about to pull off the streets of Chicago would, over the following weeks, dismantle the coldest thing inside him, more effectively than any enemy ever had. All he knew, walking toward the car with Maya wrapped in Sal's jacket and the rain still falling, was that for the first time in 20 years of running this city, he owed someone. And she was 9 years old. The dinner had lasted exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes. Dante knew because he always knew. Time was the one resource even he couldn't acquire more of, so he measured it the way other men measured money. 2 hours and 14 minutes to finalize the Northwest Corridor Agreement. To shake hands with men who smiled too much and meant half of what they said. To drink bourbon he didn't taste and eat steak he didn't want, in a restaurant he owned but rarely enjoyed. Business, always business. Marco pulled the rear door of Cavallo Nero open and Dante stepped out first, the way he always did, but not because he was reckless. Because he refused to be the kind of man who let other men take his risks. He'd made that decision at 19, standing over the body of his first boss who'd sent someone else to check a room that turned out to be occupied. Lessons like that didn't leave you. The alley behind the restaurant was narrow and wet. Rain had been falling since 7, the kind of thin, relentless Chicago rain that didn't storm, it just persisted. coating every surface in a gray glaze and filling the air with the smell of old brick and exhaust. A single overhead light buzzed above the service door, throwing a pale yellow cone across the dumpsters and the cracked asphalt. Beyond that cone, the alley dissolved into shadow. Dante paused, as he always paused, right there, 2 steps from the door, in the spot where the light reached and the shadow started. It was habit so deeply grooved it had become reflex. Scan left. Scan right. Read the alley before you commit to crossing it. Marco and Sal fanned out behind him without a word. They'd done this 1,000 times. The car was waiting 40 feet ahead, idling softly, exhaust curling white in the cold air. Nothing moved. Dante's neck was cold. He registered it and filed it as weather. He didn't know that 90 seconds earlier, in the building directly across the alley, a man with a silenced rifle had settled his crosshairs and begun his breathing pattern. And he didn't know that the exit time, the door, the precise patch of asphalt where he always paused, all of it had been provided in writing, with a timestamp, by someone who had eaten at his table. He didn't know any of it. What he knew was the cold on the back of his neck, and the fact that the overhead light was buzzing at a frequency that hadn't bothered him in 3 years of using this exit. And both of those things together made his jaw tighten slightly. Then the fire escape screamed. That's not a human scream. The metallic shriek of a small body scrambling too fast down iron steps that hadn't been maintained since the previous decade. A sound that tore through the quiet rain like a blade. Dante's eyes went up. Marco spun left. Sal's hand was already inside his jacket. The figure that hit the ground was small, impossibly small for the noise it made. A girl, dark-haired, dressed in a faded gray t-shirt that was soaked through and shorts that were wrong for the temperature by about 4 months. She landed on the alley floor in a half-crouch, sneakers skidding on wet asphalt, and she was already running before she'd fully found her balance, and she was running directly at him. And she had no time to stop, and neither did the paper cup in her hand. The collision was total. She hit Dante's chest at full speed. The cup detonated upward in a burst of cold, on dark liquid. And for one suspended second, the entire alley was frozen. Marco mid-lunge, Sal half-drawn, the girl bouncing off Dante's frame and dropping to one knee on the wet ground, the coffee spreading across Italian fabric in a stain that would not come out of anything. Then everything moved at once. Marco had her arm before she could stand. Not gently. Marco didn't know gentle in moments like this, only fast and controlled. He hauled her upright and put himself between her and Dante in one motion, his grip on her wrist professional and immovable. Sal had his weapon out, not pointed but present, his eyes already cutting to the shadows at both ends of the alley, threat assessing with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd spent 15 years being paid to keep Dante Carraro alive. The girl didn't scream. She didn't struggle against Marco's grip. She didn't look at Marco at all. She was looking at Dante's chest. On her eyes, dark brown, startling in their steadiness for a child who was soaking wet and had just run full speed into a man who outweighed her by 220 pounds, were fixed on a point just below his left lapel. And her mouth was open. Not in fear. In something more urgent than fear. Dante looked down. It was barely visible. In the rain and the low light, against the dark fabric of his ruined jacket, it might have been a reflection, a trick. Nothing. A faint tremor of red that slid off the wet silk of his lapel and dispersed into the air because he was no longer standing in the spot he'd been standing a second ago. Her collision had pushed him forward. 6 inches, maybe less. The dot was on empty air. He had enough time to think sniper and to think sightline and to think someone told them exactly where I stand. And then the shot came. A sound like a heavy book dropped flat on a table, unsuppressed and professional. And a chunk of brick exploded from the wall behind him at chest height, dust and fragments scattering across the wet ground. The alley went electric. Sal was moving toward the building across the way. Marco had the girl behind the dumpster with one arm and his phone in the other hand, already dialing. From the street, Dante heard the click of car doors and the sound of his driver repositioning. Everyone doing exactly what they were trained to do. Dante did not move. He stood in the middle of the alley with brick dust settling on his shoulders and rain falling on a $10,000 suit that was already destroyed. And he looked at the wall behind him, at the hole in it, at the precise height of the hole, which was exactly the height of his heart when he stood where he always stood. Then he turned and looked at the girl. She was crouched behind the dumpster where Marco had put her, his arm still a bar across her. But her eyes had found Dante through the gap, and she was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on a face in a very long time. Not fear of him, not calculation about him. Just the raw, stripped-down look of someone who had done the only thing they could think to do, and was now waiting to find out what it had cost them. She was shaking. He could see it from where he stood. But her jaw was set. Dante walked to the dumpster. Marco shifted automatically to give him room. Then he crouched down to the girl's level, a thing he had not done, literally lowered himself to a child's eye level in longer than he could remember. And he looked at her directly. She didn't look away. Her face was thin, the kind of thin that happened slowly, over weeks, not the thin of a child who'd missed dinner. Her t-shirt had a logo on it that had been washed so many times it was a ghost of itself. And her sneakers were tied with two different colors of lace, one white and one yellow, which meant she'd found them separately. Her dark hair was plastered to her face in the rain. There was a scrape on her left knee, fresh from the landing. She hadn't mentioned it, probably hadn't registered it. Her eyes were completely calm. "Where did you see it from?" Dante said. She didn't ask what he meant. She pointed up at the fire escape above them, the second-floor landing of the dry cleaning shop, the angle of which Dante now traced with his eyes. It gave a direct and unobstructed sight line to the patch of alley where he'd been standing. From up there in the rain, a child scavenging on a fire escape would have had a bird's-eye view of the alley and of the window across the way, where a man with a rifle had spent the last however long getting settled. She'd seen the laser before he'd even come outside. He processed that. He looked at the fire escape. He looked at the window across the alley, and which was now dark and empty. Whoever had been there was already gone, already running, already folding themselves back into the city. Professional, which meant organized, which meant this wasn't opportunistic. Someone had planned this. Someone who knew his exit. Someone who knew his timing. Someone in a very small circle of people who had sat across tables from him and shaken his hand and called him by his first name. A heat moved through him that had nothing to do with the rain, and then he let it move, and then he put it somewhere cold where he could use it later. He looked back at the girl. "What's your name?" A pause. The pause of someone who'd learned to be careful about what they gave away, even something as basic as a name. He recognized that pause. He developed it himself at approximately her age. "Maya," she said. "How long have you been back here, Maya?" Her eyes moved, a small, involuntary flicker, to the fire escape, to the dumpster. You to the service door of the restaurant 20 feet away. Mapping, he realized. She was mapping her exposure in the answer before she gave it. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks living in the alley network behind his restaurant. 3 weeks, and not one of his security rotations had flagged her, which meant she knew how to be invisible, which meant she'd had practice at it. He stood up. "She comes with us," he said to Marco, and Marco's face did the thing it did when he wanted to push back but knew better. A slight tension around the eyes, a breath held half a second too long. "Boss, we need to move. If there's a second shooter—" "There isn't," Dante said. "It was a single window setup. He's already gone." He said it with the flat certainty of someone who had spent enough years on both sides of situations like this to read their architecture. One shot, silenced, from a prepared position, clean exit. Solo job, hire, not crew. "She comes with us." He didn't look at Marco again after that. He looked at Maya, who had heard all of this and was now watching him with an expression that had shifted slightly, still guarded, still careful, but with something working behind it that might have been the very early, very tentative beginning of a calculation about whether this particular adult could be trusted. Which was a calculation she'd clearly gotten wrong before. "I'm not going to hurt you," Dante said. It was not a warm thing the way he said it. It was a factual thing, the way he might state a business term. But it was true, and something in the way he said it seemed to land as true. Because Maya looked at him for another long second, and then she nodded once and stood up. She was smaller standing than crouching. He noted that her hands were still shaking slightly, still cold, still coming down from whatever the last 10 minutes had cost her in adrenaline. She'd jumped off a fire escape in the rain to warn a stranger. A stranger who, from the outside, must have looked like the most dangerous thing in the alley, which was saying something given that there'd been a sniper. She'd done it anyway. Sal came back from the far end of the alley, moving fast. Windows empty, professional clean, nothing left. Dante nodded. He'd expected that. What he'd gotten instead was a beginning, the first thread of a thread that, once he pulled it, was going to unravel something he'd built for 20 years. He didn't know that yet. He knew only that the bullet in the wall behind him had a sender. And that sender had known things they should not have known. And that the only person in the alley who'd seen any of it coming was a 9-year-old girl who'd been sleeping on a fire escape. Marco draped his jacket over Maya's shoulders without being asked, which surprised Dante slightly, and Maya pulled it around herself without a word, and which told him she was practical before she was proud, another thing he understood. They moved to the car. Dante got in last. Before he pulled the door, he looked back at the alley one more time, at the hole in the brick, at the buzzing yellow light, at the fire escape where a child had been sitting in the rain with a scavenged cup of cold coffee when someone had been taking aim at his heart. 6 inches, and the difference between the patch of asphalt where he always stood and the patch of asphalt where a small girl's collision had pushed him. 6 inches, and 30 seconds of courage from someone who had no reason in the world to spend it on him. He got in the car. The door closed. The city moved past the windows, wet and bright and indifferent. In the seat across from him, Maya sat with Marco's jacket swallowing her whole, her dark eyes watching the streets go by with the expression of someone trying to memorize a route they weren't sure they'd be allowed to use. Dante said nothing. He was already thinking. The exit route. The timing. The 4 men who knew both. He had a traitor. He had a dead sight line and a live wall and a 9-year-old witness who'd been in that alley for 3 weeks and had ears that worked and eyes that didn't miss much. He looked at Maya. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. But something had shifted in the car, in the rain-dark ride north through the city. Something quiet and irreversible. The way the first crack in ice doesn't make a sound, but means everything that comes after is different. Dante Carraro, who had not trusted anyone in 20 years, was beginning, very slowly, to pay attention. The penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor of a building Dante owned under a name that didn't connect to him in any public record, and the elevator required a key and a code. The stairwells had doors that only opened from inside. The windows were reinforced and tinted and looked out over the city like the eyes of something very old and very patient. Maya stood in the entrance hall and looked at the ceiling. It was high, 12 feet at least, and clean and white. And Dante understood, watching her look at it, that she was registering the space the way someone does when they've been living without it. And when every space you've occupied for months has been low and tight and provisional, a ceiling that high reads as something close to impossible. She didn't say anything. She just looked for about 3 seconds, and then she pulled Marco's jacket tighter and followed Dante into the kitchen. He told her to sit at the island. She sat but on the edge of the stool, weight forward, the posture of someone who hadn't fully decided yet whether to stay. He'd seen that posture before. He'd had it himself, and at around her age. In the first place, anyone had ever told him he was safe. A word he hadn't believed then either. He opened the refrigerator. It was stocked by someone who came on Tuesdays and filled it with things he rarely ate. Organized, labeled, efficient. The refrigerator of a man whose life ran on systems and who derived no real pleasure from any of them. He pulled out what he could assemble without thought. Leftover pasta from a restaurant 2 nights ago. Bread, a container of soup that had never been opened. He put the soup on the stove without asking what she wanted. She didn't look like a child who had the luxury of preferences right now. While the soup heated, he stood at the counter with his phone and called Marco, who was already in the building's security office on the 3rd floor running the camera feeds from the alley. "I need the list," Dante said. "Everyone who knew the Thursday exit. Name, timeline, method of communication. Everything." "Already pulling it," Marco said. There was a pause. Keyboard sounds. The particular silence of a man who already knows what he's going to find and doesn't like it. "Dante, it's a short list." "I know how short it is." He hung up. The soup was beginning to move at the edges. Maya was watching the stove with an expression of concentrated patience. Not the patience of someone relaxed, but the patience of someone who had learned to wait without making it visible how much they needed what they were waiting for. He ladled it into a bowl and set it in front of her with the bread and a glass of water. And she said nothing. But both hands came around the bowl immediately, like it might be taken. He turned back to the counter. He had 4 names in his head. He'd had them since the alley, and turning them over the same way he might turn over a damaged piece of equipment, looking for the fracture point, the place where it had failed. The Thursday exit was a protocol known to 4 people inside his organization: Marco, Sal, his logistics coordinator Renzo, and Vincent. Marco and Sal had been flanking him in the alley, which was not exculpatory on its own. A leak could be engineered without personal risk, and it was cleaner that way. But his instinct on both of them had been bedrock for 15 years, and instinct, when you'd maintained it carefully and honestly, was data. Renzo had been in Detroit since Monday, which didn't eliminate him but complicated the timeline. Vincent had been at Cavallo Nero until 40 minutes before Dante left. Had shaken his hand, had said drive safe the way he'd said it 100 times. That particular warmth that came from 30 years of knowing someone, not from growing up 2 blocks apart on the west side, from being in each other's corners since before either of them was anything worth being in the corner of. Dante picked up his phone and looked at Vincent's name in his contacts. He didn't call. He put the phone face down on the counter. Maya finished the soup. She ate the bread. She drank the water. She did all of it with the focused, economical attention of someone consuming fuel rather than food. And when she was done, she looked up and found him watching her and didn't flinch. "There's more," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm okay." He almost said something to that. He didn't. He refilled the bowl anyway and set it back in front of her. And she looked at it for a moment with something that briefly threatened to become an expression. And then she picked up the spoon and kept eating. He sat down across the island from her, and this was not something he planned. He was not a man who sat at his own kitchen island, who inhabited the casual domestic geography of a home rather than moving through it functionally. But he sat, and he looked at her, and he said, "In the alley. Before tonight. You heard things." It wasn't a question. It was a door, and he was opening it and leaving it open to see if she'd walk through. Maya set her spoon down. She looked at him with that same stillness. That particular quality of attention he kept noticing in her. The kind that belonged to children who had learned that adults asked questions for reasons, and that the reasons weren't always safe. "2 nights ago," she said, "there was a man outside the service door, back corner near the gray pipe. He was on the phone." Dante said nothing. He waited. He said, She paused, and he watched her do something he recognized as retrieval, not invention. Vasa, the eyes going slightly unfocused the way they did when someone was accessing something stored precisely rather than constructing it loosely. He said, "The Thursday exit is confirmed, same time." And then he said something about a rate, the Solano rate, he called it. And then he said, "It's clean, nobody knows." The kitchen was very quiet. Dante sat with those words for a moment, not processing them, because he'd processed them instantly, before she'd even finished the sentence. But sitting with what they meant about the last 30 years of his life. Thursday exit was a phrase that existed inside a closed system. It had never been written down. It had never been texted. It existed only in spoken conversation between the 4 people who managed his movement protocols. Because Dante had learned young that anything written could be found, and anything found could be used. The Solano faction was the only organization in Chicago with both the motive and the resources to hire a professional single-window shooter and clean the scene in under 4 minutes. And the Solano rate was not a phrase a man used on the phone unless he was being paid by them. He looked at Maya. "Did you see his face?" "Mostly his back," she said. "He had dark hair and a ring on his right hand, gold, square. I noticed it because it caught the light from inside." Dante knew the ring, or he'd watched it be placed on a finger at a wedding in 2009 in a church on the west side, where he'd stood as best man in a suit that had also cost more than it should have and meant more than it cost. He got up from the island and walked to the window. Below, Chicago spread itself in every direction, indifferent and illuminated. A city that had been making and destroying men like him since before either of them were born. He stood at the glass, and he let himself feel, for exactly the amount of time he could afford to feel it, what it meant that Vincent, who had held him upright at his mother's funeral, who had been the first call on every bad night for 3 decades, had sold his life for a faction leadership deal and called it clean. Then he put the feeling away. He called Marco. Run Vincent. Everything. Communications for the last 6 months. Financials. Movements. And pull the service entrance camera for Tuesday night, 2 nights ago, between 9 and 11. Marco's silence was half a second too long. "You're sure?" "Run it," Dante said. He turned back to Maya, who had finished the second bowl of soup and was now sitting with both hands folded on the counter, watching him with the quiet, careful attention of someone who understood, without being told, that what was happening in this room was serious and that her role in it was not finished. "You have a good memory," he said. My mom used to say I remembered everything I wasn't supposed to," Maya said. And then something moved across her face. Quick, controlled, suppressed with a practiced speed that broke something in him slightly, because no child should be that practiced at suppressing things. "She died 8 months ago," she added simply, as fact rather than bid for sympathy. "After that, I was in a shelter for a while. Then I wasn't." He looked at her. He wanted to ask several questions, or he asked the one that mattered first. "How old are you?" "9. 9. He did the math on 8 months alone, of which 3 weeks had been in his alley, and the math produced a number of additional questions about the shelter, about what then I wasn't meant, about who, specifically, had been responsible for a 9-year-old girl cycling out of a placement with no family listed and no follow-up. He didn't ask those questions yet. He filed them in the same cold place he'd put his feelings about Vincent, where things were kept until they could be used properly. "You're staying here tonight," he said. Maya looked at him. "Okay," she said. Just that. She asked him, maybe 20 minutes later, while he was on his third call of the night, and she was sitting on the couch with her knees pulled up and a blanket someone had left folded over the arm, about the tattoos on his hands, and he held the phone away from his face and looked at her. "Old decisions," he said. She looked at his hands for a moment. "Do you regret them?" He'd been asked that question before, in various forms, by people who thought they were being profound. He'd never found it interesting. Coming from her at that moment, in that particular tone, genuinely curious, no agenda the way a child asks because they actually want to know. It landed differently. "Some of them," he said. He went back to the call, and within 48 hours, Marco had built a file. The service entrance camera had captured Vincent at the Gray Pipe on Tuesday night at 9:47 p.m. Right hand visible, the square gold ring catching exactly the light Maya had described. A burner phone purchased in cash at a convenience store in Pilsen had been traced through tower pings to Vincent's known locations over the preceding 6 weeks. A wire transfer, routed through 2 shell accounts that Dante's financial people dismantled in an afternoon, had landed $40,000 in an account connected to a name that connected 3 steps out to the Solano organization's known financial infrastructure. It was thorough. It was damning. It was the work of a man who thought he'd been careful, but hadn't been careful enough, because he'd underestimated the network he was trying to betray. Dante read the file at the kitchen island at 2 a.m. while Maya slept in the spare room, in a bed with actual sheets, with the window latched from the inside, because she'd asked about the latch before she'd asked about anything else, which told him everything about the last 8 months of her life. He'd arranged a doctor for the following morning, a woman he trusted who made house calls and didn't ask questions she wasn't supposed to ask. And he'd called a social worker, a man named Gerald, who operated at the intersection of the city's formal and informal systems, and who owed Dante a favor he'd never called in. Gerald had pulled Maya's file in under an hour. The picture it painted was not complicated, and it was not unusual. And that, Dante found, was the part that made him the coldest. A mother who'd gotten sick and then gotten sicker and then died, the way people without adequate insurance died, slowly, then suddenly. A temporary placement that lasted 4 months before the funding cycle ended. A system that had noted Maya's departure from the shelter with a single administrative checkbox and done nothing further, because she was one of several thousand cases and the resources didn't exist to follow them all. And because nobody with actual authority had looked at the specific face behind the case number and thought this child is 9 years old and has no one. He sat with that for a long time, while he was a man who had spent his adult life operating entirely outside systems, who had in fact built a career on the premise that systems were for other people, that the real world ran on power and leverage and the relationships between men who understood both. He had never in his life been angry at a system. He'd been angry at people, at betrayals, at specific failures of specific individuals. Abstract institutional failure had always struck him as someone else's territory. A concern for people who worked in offices and attended city council meetings and believed in the mechanisms of civic life. He found, at 2 a.m, reading a 9-year-old girl's case file, that he was furious in a way he didn't have a familiar framework for. Not hot, not immediate, just a deep, structural anger. The kind that settled into the foundation of a thing rather than burning on its surface. When the Solano faction moved on the 4th day, 2 men, no connection to anything traceable, had been making inquiries in the South Loop, asking about a girl, dark hair, young, seen near Cavallo Nero on Thursday night. Dante's people identified them within 6 hours and intercepted them in a parking garage in Bridgeport before they got within 2 miles of the building. The men were professionals. They didn't have much to say, but the message required no translation. The faction knew the hit had failed, knew there was a witness, and had decided the witness was a liability. Maya was a 9-year-old girl in a spare bedroom on the 42nd floor of a building nobody could connect to her. She was also now a documented target. Dante stood in the security office and looked at the photographs his people had taken in the parking garage and felt the situation clarify the way situations did when they stopped being complicated and became simple. This was no longer about Vincent or about the Solanos, or about the $10,000 suit currently folded in a bag, waiting for a dry cleaner who would eventually tell him it was unsalvageable. It was about a 9-year-old who had jumped off a fire escape in the rain to save a stranger, and who was now in danger because of it, and who was asleep 40 floors above him in a room where the window locked from the inside. He walked back to the elevator, rode it up to 42, stood in the kitchen in the dark for a moment, listening to the particular silence of a home that had someone else in it. A quality of silence he hadn't heard in so long, he'd forgotten it had a texture. Then he sat down at the island, opened the file Marco had built on Vincent, and began to plan. He gave Vincent a day's notice. Not because he needed to. Vincent would have come immediately, had always come immediately, 30 years of conditioned loyalty running so deep it had apparently survived even betrayal. But because Dante wanted to watch him arrive knowing, wanted to see, in the set of his shoulders and the timing of his breath, whether the man understood why he'd been called to the warehouse on a Sunday night, with no agenda given and no other names mentioned. Vincent arrived at 8. He was dressed well, as always. Vincent had developed expensive taste somewhere in his late 30s and had never apologized for it. Dark coat, good shoes, the square gold ring on his right hand, catching the warehouse's overhead lights exactly the way it had caught the service entrance light on a Tuesday night that he didn't know had been witnessed. He walked in and saw the table, the file on it, Marco and Sal at the edges of the room, not aggressive, just present. Fast and Dante standing at the far end, hands in his pockets, watching him cross the floor. Vincent's stride didn't break. That, Dante noted, was either courage or a very practiced performance of it. And he'd spent enough years watching Vincent move through the world to understand that in this moment, it was neither. It was the specific forward momentum of a man who had already decided, somewhere in the last 24 hours, is that there was no version of this conversation he could avoid, and that arriving with composure was the only card he had left. He stopped at the table. He looked at the file. He didn't touch it. "Dante," he said. "Sit down, Vincent." He sat. Dante remained standing. He opened the file, and he walked through it the way he would walk through any business matter. Methodically, without heat, beginning with the wire transfer and moving through the burner phone records and ending with the camera still of Vincent at the gray pipe behind Cavallo Nero on Tuesday night. Right hand visible, gold ring lit. Vincent looked at the photograph for a long time. "That could be anyone," he said. It was reflexive. The first move in a denial that his face was already abandoning. "The ring," Dante said. Vincent looked at the ring on his own hand. Something went through his expression that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "The phrase Thursday exit," Dante continued. "Used in a phone call 2 nights before the attempt. To a number that connects to the Solano financial network through 2 intermediaries your people apparently thought were clean." He paused. They weren't. The warehouse was very quiet. Somewhere in the building structure, something metallic settled with a low tick. Outside, and the city moved at its usual indifferent pace, entirely unaware that 30 years of a particular friendship were ending in a room that smelled of cold concrete and old machinery. "How long?" Dante said. Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then, the skimming. 5 years. Dante had suspected 3. He absorbed the correction without showing it. The debt to the Solanos. How much? 800,000. Vincent said it flatly, like a number on a page, like it was someone else's problem. It started as a short-term arrangement, moving their money through our logistics accounts during the Northside consolidation. Then they had the numbers, and the numbers meant they had me, and it kept going. And then it was too much to pay back and not enough to run on, and they offered me. He stopped. "They offered you the syndicate," Dante said. "After you were gone, yes." He said it simply, without the softening that a lesser man might have added. "I'm sorry, I didn't want to. I had no choice." Vincent had always been honest in his way. It was, Dante thought, the most expensive quality a dishonest man could have. "I thought you'd never know," Vincent said. "The exit was clean. The shooter was the best money could buy. And I thought..." He looked at the table. "I didn't know about the girl." "No?" Dante said. "You didn't?" He let that sit in the room for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket, and he put his phone on the table, face up, with a name on the screen. Detective Rios. A number he'd dialed twice in 15 years, once to provide information that had closed a case that was getting too close to his operations, once to call in the kind of marker that those transactions generated. Off books. Mutual. The particular relationship that existed between law enforcement and men like Dante in cities like this. Not corruption exactly. It was more a negotiated understanding of where certain lines were drawn and why. Vincent looked at the phone. Then at Dante. His expression shifted. Not to fear, but to something more complicated. A confusion that was almost affront. In 30 years, not one problem in this organization had gone to law enforcement. Not one. The warehouse had its own resolution protocols, and everyone who had ever been brought here understood what those protocols were. "Dante, he's going to walk through that door in 10 minutes, Dante said. "With 2 people from his unit. You're going to be arrested. The file goes with you, originals and copies, 3 separate locations. You're going to be charged with conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud across 4 jurisdictions, and material support of a criminal organization. He paused. You'll want a good lawyer. I won't recommend one. Vincent stared at him. You're sending me to prison. I'm sending you to court, Dante said. What happens after that is between you and the evidence. The silence stretched. Marco shifted almost imperceptibly at the edge of the room. Sal was watching the floor with the studied neutrality of a man deciding not to have opinions right now. Why? Vincent said. It was a genuine question. He wasn't arguing. He was asking the way a man asks when the thing in front of him doesn't map onto any version of reality he'd prepared for. Dante was quiet for a moment. He thought about how to say it, and then he thought about the fact that it didn't need to be said well, and only honestly. There's a kid in my apartment, he said, who already knows what it costs when men like us don't choose differently. Vincent looked at him for a long time after that. Something in his face settled. Not acceptance, exactly. More a kind of exhausted recognition. The expression of a man who had been running a calculation for 5 years and was finally seeing the complete sum. Detective Rios arrived at 8:17 with 2 people from his unit, and then Vincent Mara was escorted from the warehouse without incident. And the file, originals, and 3 copies went with him. And that was the end of 30 years, in the way that endings that have been building for a long time often are. Quieter than expected, and somehow larger. Dante stood alone in the warehouse for a few minutes after they left. Marco had offered to stay. He'd told him to go. He stood in the concrete quiet, and he looked at the empty table where the file had been, and he felt the particular weight of a decision that couldn't be reversed, which was different from the irreversibility of the warehouse's usual resolutions. Different because it had a future attached to it. A process, a court, a record, a consequence that existed in the formal architecture of the world rather than in the dark architecture of his. He wasn't sure yet what to do with that difference. He filed it in the place where he kept things that required more processing than he currently had time for, and he walked out. The legal process took 11 weeks. Dante funded it through an attorney he'd used twice before for legitimate real estate transactions, which gave him the strange experience of writing checks that produced only paperwork rather than outcomes he controlled. The social worker Gerald navigated the formal guardianship process with the competence of someone who knew where every body was buried in the city's family services bureaucracy, which was useful because the bureaucracy had several. There were forms and hearings and a home evaluation conducted by a woman named Patricia who wore sensible shoes and asked Dante questions about his daily schedule and income sources with the placid tenacity of someone who'd been lied to professionally for 20 years and had developed an excellent filter. He answered her questions. Some of them required careful construction. Most of them, he realized halfway through, he could answer plainly, because the life he actually lived, the penthouse, on the security, the stability of the building, and the neighborhood, looked, from a purely material standpoint, like an excellent environment for a child. The irony of that was not lost on him. Patricia approved the placement. She noted in her report that the child appeared comfortable in the home, that she had a clearly defined and secure personal space, and that the relationship between guardian and ward, while unconventional and dynamic, demonstrated consistent care and appropriate boundaries. Maya, when Dante told her that the guardianship was confirmed and she was staying, said, "Okay." Then she went back to looking at the school catalog he'd put in front of her, which she'd been studying with the focused intensity she brought to most things, turning pages with the deliberate care of someone who understood that what they were choosing mattered. She chose a school on the north side. She chose it she told him. Because it had a good science program, and also because she liked the color of the building in the photograph, which was a yellow that looked like it had been chosen by someone who actually wanted students to feel something when they arrived. He enrolled her the following Monday. The bedroom she chose, out of 2 options he had prepared, was the one with the east-facing window, the smaller of the 2, the one that looked out over the building's interior courtyard rather than the skyline. He'd expected her to choose the view. She chose the courtyard. Quieter, she told him when he asked. When the contractor came to install the secondary lock she'd asked for, a simple sliding bolt, interior only, nothing a person couldn't open in 20 seconds from outside in an emergency. The man had looked at Dante with a question forming on his face, and Dante had looked back at him with a look that closed the question, and the lock was installed that afternoon. Maya tested it 6 times the first night. He knew because he heard the soft slide of it from the hallway, testing, confirming, building the knowledge in her hands that it worked. He stood in the hall for a moment, and then he walked away. And he didn't mention it in the morning, and she didn't either. And 2 weeks later, she stopped testing it every night, because she'd built enough evidence that it was real. That, he thought, was what safety actually looked like. Not the presence of security, but the accumulation of proof. The slow construction of trust through repeated confirmations that the world would behave the way it was supposed to. It was something he understood from a professional standpoint. The principle of verified reliability. He hadn't thought before about what it looked like in a child's hands sliding a bolt in the dark. 3 months after the alley, on a Wednesday evening in November, Dante sat at the kitchen island with coffee he wasn't drinking and a phone he wasn't looking at, and the specific quality of silence that the apartment had developed. Different now, inhabited, shaped by the presence of another person's life going on in nearby rooms. Maya came out at 7:15 with her school bag and her math homework, and the expression she wore when she was about to engage with something that had not yet conceded to her, which was the expression of someone who intended to win, and was simply in the early stages of working out how. She sat across the island from him, spread the worksheet out, and began. He watched her work for a while without watching her, the way he'd gotten accustomed to doing. Peripheral attention, not surveillance. She moved through the first 3 problems at the pace of someone building momentum and stopped at the 4th like she'd hit a wall. He could see the problem from where he sat. He recognized the type, a 2-step equation where the error almost everyone made was in the order of operations, the place where an assumption about what to do first led everything that followed off course. He knew this because he had made his living for 20 years on the principle that the order in which you do things determines the outcome, and that most people got it wrong because they operated on instinct rather than structure. He reached across, turned the paper slightly toward himself, unpicked up her pencil, and wrote 1 line. Just the first step. The correct order of the operation, written out so the logic was visible. Then he turned the paper back and set the pencil down. He picked up his coffee. Maya looked at what he'd written. He watched her, in his peripheral vision, trace the logic of it. Not just copying the step, but following it, pulling the thread of why this step preceded the next one, building the understanding rather than borrowing the answer. Her pencil moved. She finished the problem. She checked it against the logic of the step he'd written, and the check held, and she moved to the next problem and applied the same order without prompting. He looked at her for a moment. She didn't look up. She was already 3 lines into the next problem, her pencil moving with the particular confidence of someone who had just acquired a tool and was immediately using it. He looked away. He drank his coffee, and there was something moving in him that he didn't have a clean word for. He had a large vocabulary for threat, for leverage, for the various textures of power and obligation and loyalty and betrayal. He had a reasonable vocabulary for the more mechanical emotions. Satisfaction, frustration, the cold clarity of resolved tension. He did not have a precise word for what it was to sit in a kitchen that had been silent for years and hear a pencil moving across paper and feel, and in the most stripped down and unfamiliar way, that the room was correctly occupied. That something which had been wrong about the silence, which he hadn't known was wrong until it changed, was now right. He was not a reformed man. He understood that. The warehouse was still the warehouse. The file he carried in his head on every person he'd ever done business with was still being updated. The city outside was still the city he'd built himself inside of, through methods that no court would look at favorably, and he was still the man who'd built them. None of that had been erased or reclassified, but there was a 9-year-old girl at his kitchen island who had jumped off a fire escape in the rain to save a stranger with a paper cup of cold coffee, who tested her door bolt every night for 2 weeks until she knew it was real, who chose a yellow school because someone had obviously wanted students to feel something when they arrived, Ducal, who had repeated a phone conversation word for word with the precise memory of a child who stored everything, because everything might matter someday. She had come to him with nothing. She had no claim on him, no leverage, no strategy. She had seen a red dot in a stranger and had made a calculation that most adults, most people in any room he'd ever occupied, would not have made. She had chosen, with 6 seconds and a paper cup, to act.